This week marks 2 years of Russia's war on Ukraine, with Putin's military marking its most significant territorial gain in 9 months, capturing an eastern Ukrainian city. A military victory that coincides with the prison death of Putin's strongest critic, opposition leader Alexei Navalny. The U.S. today announced, quote, hundreds and hundreds of new sanctions on Russia in light of Navalny's death. Canada summoned the Russian ambassador, yesterday, but has not announced new sanctions. Government sources say they are considering all options. As Putin continues to rebuff those sanctions, though, and exercise his military might, public opinion polling shows waning support here in Canada for increased aid to Ukraine, particularly among Conservatives. Is the world ready for a prolonged conflict? Let's bring back the front bench. Christy Clark, John Tory, and Tom Mulcair here. Tom, I'll start with you. There's a lot to unpack there, but on that primary question of whether or not the world, and Canada more specifically, is ready for just how long this war likely will go on, what is your assessment?
That is, I believe, Vassy, the key question. And another way of stating it, perhaps, is to ask the following question. What's the end game? Because, of course, it can't go on forever. We know that. That's a given. We also know that Russia has 3 times the population of Ukraine. That recent Russian victory shows that they're starting to figure things out on the military front. How long can we keep helping and hope that we'll produce a positive result? We're watching the House of Representatives in Washington play games at the behest of Donald Trump, stalling any real attempt to get the necessary money approved there to get the military equipment that would flow from that decision. How long is it going to be possible to continue like this without starting some form of effort, without ever accepting, as Trudeau correctly calls it, the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine? When is it going to begin to be possible to start talking about getting to an end result of peace in that region? We tend to forget, because we've been watching this horror for 2 years, that this is Russia invading a country in Europe. All of the European allies have moved in whatever they can to help Ukraine, which has been putting up an incredible fight. It's admirable. It's unbelievable what they've been able to accomplish. And yet, at our own peril, we will forget that at some point there has to be an adult discussion about how we get to an end game that will allow peace to be restored in that region.
Christy, in the interim, against the backdrop of some of the waning support, and look, overwhelmingly, there still is support in Canada for sending aid. It's just the degree to which we're doing so that's changed over the past 2 years. The level of support has certainly evolved over the past 2 years. You know, if you were still in office, how would you be able, or how would you think to try and convince Canadians that it's still necessary?
Well, it's a tough one. Canada's political discourse around this, I think, has been poisoned a lot by the discussion in the United States, led by useful idiots like Tucker Carlson. I think, you know, the reason Russia, let's not forget, the reason Russia thought it was they could get away with this illegal invasion of Ukraine was because they got away with it in Crimea, and the world did almost nothing to stop that. If we let them get away with what's going on in Ukraine, and then what's next? The rest of Ukraine, the border with Poland, a conflict with NATO in which all of us would be drawn, nuclear states around the world starting to feel emboldened in the absence of American leadership on safety and security. I mean, we all chafe a little that America is the world's policeman. Well, thank goodness America is the world's policeman, because Canada has no military. Neither does France, to speak of, or Germany to speak of. The only people in Europe these days who've been building a military are the Polish. We really need America to engage, and I think Donald Trump's efforts to try and disengage America hold the potential to really destabilize the world, and we will begin to see that in Ukraine, should we, as the rest of the world, give up on Ukraine the way Donald Trump suggests we should.
I mean, the pressure is already there on allies like Canada and other allies in Europe, John, to fill the gap that, although the president is very supportive of sending aid, as Tom referenced, there's a huge aid package stuck in Congress right now, in the House right now. I had the U.S. ambassador to NATO on the show earlier, and she talked about how, you know, she's admitting, as are many U.S. officials, there's part of the reason that eastern city just fell is because of that aid being stuck. How much pressure do you think there is on allies like Canada to fill that gap, and are we even able to?
Well, I think we can. I'll come back to that. But I think a curse should fall on those who politicize this in the United States or in Canada. Because, and look, we'd all wish this war, frankly, at the beginning, I think we all thought it was going to be over in a bad way in 2 weeks. So it is 2 years. It's a long time. There's been a lot of tragedy. But thank God the Ukrainians have had the support and have had the gumption to fight the way they have and to hold this to more or less a stalemate. But, I had the experience of going there last summer. And I stood in front of the graves of the young men who've been killed in the war. I stood in front of graves of young children who've been killed from these atrocities committed by Mr. Putin and the Russians. And I can tell you something. When I looked at that and when I met the refugee families coming here to Canada, I look at the financial commitment we are making as relatively inconsequential compared to what was said very well by Tom and Christy, which is a democracy in Europe that was invaded illegally, as Mr. Trudeau said, by Putin and Russia, and that if we just let that go, this is the time to stand tall and to stand firm. And I think this country can afford to do it. This country should do it. And the United States is a different kettle of fish, unfortunately, because of what Trump is up to. But I think it's the time to stand in there. And when you say how long can it go on, Tom is right. There does come a time when you have to start talking about an end to it. But that's not now, I don't think. I think that would be a complete capitulation. That would be a terrible mistake.
Yeah.
Tom, do you think that and both Christy and John referenced the sort of evolution of political discourse in this country as well? The first signs of cleavage were over this free trade agreement, and we've talked about that as a panel before. Outside of that, it has not been what's happening in the United States. Do you anticipate it to remain where it is, or do you think those political cleavages will be amplified as this war goes on?
Mr. Poilievre has been doing an admirable job of picking and choosing communities, cultural, religious, ethnic communities. He knows how to pitch to them. He also is very much aware that in areas where he's got his strongest support, you've got very large communities of Canadians of Ukrainian extraction. You've got about 1.5 million Canadians with some Ukrainian roots. So that's something that every politician in Canada has to be very much aware of, Vassy, and they are very much aware of. This is a question of principle. You're right, we've talked about it before, but it's worth bearing in mind that Mr. Poilievre managed to find an excuse. His reading of that agreement showed him that there was something in there about a carbon tax that allowed him to vote against it. It was the very fact of voting against it that for me was the most revealing. But one of the things I've learned in watching Poilievre is he's got very deep information. He's working with data that nobody else seems to have. And the polling came out after showing a softening of support in Canada for the continued support for Ukraine. It seems to me that Poilievre is playing a very close to the line game with that by using the excuse of the trade deal and the carbon tax. But is there actually a softening in Canada? I don't sense it in the people that I talk to. Canadians stand foursquare with Ukraine because especially people who have known a history of difficulty in their home country, they realize what we're dealing with here. But at the same time, Canada has been talking a lot about sending money. I love John's expression. It really is a small amount that we've promised, but we haven't even delivered what we've promised. So it is becoming intensely political here, not as bad as in the United States, but we've got to be very much aware of it. Is there going to be a time when Canada starts to retrench and to pull back? I hope not, because I do think that we have to do everything we can to help Ukraine, but I sincerely believe that we've got to use our own experience as peacemakers as part of the effort here to get to a solution that everybody can live with. That's what we have to be working for.